Yes.
Okay, we're up to Daf Samach Gimel Amid Beis, a few lines from the bottom. So, what the Gemara is going to begin in today's Daf, it's going to try to find opinions that agree with Rabbi Shmuel. If you remember, what we said yesterday is that the Omer needs an isaron of flour, of barley flour. Now, during the weekday, Rabbi Shmuel holds that they would sift with 5 saw. They would cut 5 saw and sift because that way it's easier and you'll get the best product. But on Shabbos, we only use 3 saw, even though it's more challenging and also it's not going to be as refined. But we don't want to be Mechal Shabbos more, so we'd rather do more Merakid on less flour than to cut more, which involves kaitzer and other malachas. And the Chum disagree. They say, no. Both on Shabbos and the weekday, 3 is enough. But Rabbi Shmuel holds that on Shabbos, basically, we're going to choose to do less tircha, less cutting. That's Rabbi Shmuel Shita. So the Gemara is going to attempt to bring Tanoim, it's a couple attempts, to bring Tanoim that agree with Rabbi Shmuel. So Amar Rabba, Rabbi Shmuel agrees with Rabbi Shmuel b'noish Rabbi Yechim ben Breika. Amar Davar Echad. This Rabbi Shmuel is in line with the Shita of Rabbi Shmuel b'noish Rabbi Yechim ben Breika. What's Rabbi Shmuel b'noish Rabbi Yechim ben Breika? It's a Tanya. Arba Aseh Shechaliyas b'Shabbos. If Erev Pesach falls on Shabbos, so they would bring the Karban Pesach on Shabbos, because it's Doicha Shabbos. Now the halach is generally, the average year, they would skin the Karban Pesach fully, take off the entire skin, and that way they can get to the Emurim very nicely. But on Shabbos, Mafshidis HaPesach HaDachaza. Div Rabbi Shmuel ben Breika. Rabbi Shmuel ben Breika says you don't skin the entire animal, because that's a tircha on Shabbos, but rather you just skin up to the chest, and then you reach in and get the Emurim. And then Matzei Shabbos, you'll skin the rest. So the Chacham disagree. The Chacham say no. Actually, after school, the Chacham say no. Shabbos is no different. So what do you see? You see that Rabbi Shmuel ben Breika says that on Shabbos we'd rather less tircha. If I can get away with less skinning of the animal, because all I have to get to is the emurim, and I don't have to skin the whole animal, even though maybe it's nicer to skin the whole animal and it'll be an easier process. But if I can get away with doing less, I'm going to do less. And the Gemara feels that that's the same thing as Rabbi Shmuel. On a weekday, you have 5 saw, but if I can get away with 3, I'm going to get away with 3. So they're both a lockstep, that on Shabbos, we try to minimize the tircha. Says the Gemara, you see that Rabbi Shmuel ben Breika holds, if it's possible to avoid extra labor on Shabbos, we avoid it. And that's why you don't skin the whole animal. So he would agree with Rabbi Shmuel, because it's possible to get an isarim from 3, we're not going to be mashriach and do 5. The Gemara feels that they're the same. The Gemara rejects it on 2 counts. Neither has to agree with each other. Rabbi Shmuel doesn't have to agree with Rabbi Shmuel ben Breika, and vice versa as well. Mimai, I don't think they're comparable. Dilma ad kan lekam Rabbi Shmuel hacha. Perhaps Rabbi Shmuel only said a shita here, meaning maybe Rabbi Shmuel would actually disagree with Rabbi Shmuel ben Breika. I'll tell you why. Maybe Rabbi Shmuel only said a shita here with the 3 saw, only using 3 saw. It's limited to 3 saw. El dilaka bizayin kachim. Aval hasam deka bizayin kachim. Ema maid leil rabbanon. Ema leil karabanon tzvirle. Perhaps he agrees with the rabbanon. Why? The rabbanon shita is that you should skin the whole animal. Why is that? Because they feel that leaving a flap of skin open, just enough to get to the emurim, is a bizayon. So, just because Rabbi Shmuel over here says that we limit the tircha to 3 saw, does not necessarily mean that he agrees with Rabbi Shmuel ben Breika over there. Perhaps over here he says, if we could limit it and it's not a bizayon, I'm going to limit it. But over there, the limitation creates a bizayon. Maybe he won't agree with the Rabbi Shmuel. Maybe he agrees with the Rabbanon. And vice versa. Maybe Rabbi Shmuel ben Breika doesn't agree with Rabbi Shmuel over here. I'll tell you why. Rabbi Shmuel ben I'll say it out so I'll say it inside. Rabbi Shmuel ben Breika's shita is that you don't have to skin the whole animal. I'll tell you why. The purpose of skinning the animal is to get to the emurim. It does as good of a job when you skin the animal, when you skin half of it, when you skin all of it. So he says just skin half of it, because the job is the same. But over here, the purpose is to get an isaron of fine barley. Perhaps Rabbi Shmuel holds that if to get that fine flour in a better way, I need 5 saw, then do the 5 saw. Meaning, it could be that Rabbi Shmuel ben Breika only said his sheet over there because the end result is the same whether you skin the animal halfway or whole way. So he says skin halfway because the result is the same. But over here, where the result perhaps is different, if you use 5 saw, it is a finer, better outcome than if you use 3, according to Rabbi Shmuel. So then maybe you should use 5. So they're not related at all. Ad kan like Rabbi Shmuel ben Oshir Rechem Berga Hasam el disabile tzarich gavaya v'li tzarich achuli Shabbos. Over there, you fulfill the job without being mechal Shabbos anymore. You don't have to skin the whole animal. But over here, if you use 3 saw, the outcome is not as good as 5 saw. Perhaps he holds like the Rabbanan. And therefore, the two shitas are unrelated. Okay, attempt number 2 to find the Tana who agrees with Rabbi Shmuel. Elam Rabba, Rabbi Shmuel, Rav Chanina, Skana Kohanim, Amr Davar Echad. Rabbi Shmuel holds like Rav Chanina, Skana Kohanim. What's Rav Chanina, Skana Kohanim? It's the further part of our Mishnah. The first part of the Mishnah was how much saw to thresh on Shabbos. Rabbi Shmuel said normally 5, we'll do 3. Then the Mishnah said how many people are involved. So Rav Chanina Skana Kohanim Shita is that during the weekday you have 3 people cut, 3 people sickle, 3 people thresh, but on Shabbos only 1. The Rabbanan say no, on Shabbos and the weekday is the same, 3 for both. What do you see? That you see that Rav Chanina Skana Kohanim holds normally 3 down to 1. Rav Yishmael holds normally 5 down to 3. So you see that on Shabbos they're both lockstep, that we minimize and we do a lesser tircha. That during the weekday Rav Chanina holds normally you have 3 people, but on Shabbos 1. So that's in lockstep with Rabbi Shmuel, that normally you thresh 5 sa and on Shabbos 3. That's the Gemara Shita. The Gemara says Shabbos next to b'yachid b'magalech b'kuba achas u'b'chol b'shloisha b'shalosh kubas b'shalosh magalos b'chomer me'echad Shabbos echachol b'shalosh kubas b'shalosh magalos mi loy kamer Rav Chanina Skana Kohanim Hasam. So you see Rav Chanina Skana Kohanim Shita is kiven de'ef shaloi tarchinan, because I could reap it with 1 person, I'm not going to get 3. Hachanami kiven de'ef shaloi tarchinan. The Gemara makes a comparison between the two shitas. The Gemara again will reject it, and the Gemara is going to say that the two shitas are unrelated. That perhaps Rav Chanina Skana Kohanim doesn't agree with Rabbi Shmuel, and perhaps Rabbi Shmuel does not agree with Rav Skana Kohanim. Perhaps Rabbi Shmuel does not agree with Rav Chanina Skana Kohanim. I'll tell you why. Rabbi Shmuel's shita is that normally you have 5, but on Shabbos you have 3. I'll tell you why. Because at the end of the day, you're going to get flour out of 5, you're going to get flour out of 3. There's no difference. But the how many people to do it, where during the weekday you have 3, and on Shabbos Rav Chanina says 1, perhaps Rabbi Shmuel doesn't agree with that. I'll tell you why. There's a reason to have 3. Chazal wanted to have 3, as I mentioned when we did the Mishnah yesterday. The reason to have 3 is because the Baisusim disagreed with Chazal. They darshaned that you bring the Karban Omer not on the first day of Chol Hamoed, but the first Sunday of Chol Hamoed, because they said Macharas HaShabbos. So we want to publicize that they're wrong. So the 3 person is to publicize it. So there's a purpose of having 3, and perhaps that purpose makes it permissible on Shabbos. Meaning, the fact that Rabbi Shmuel said that instead of 5, you're going to have 3 sa, doesn't mean that he's into just minimizing on Shabbos. Perhaps he feels that it's not necessary to have 5. The outcome will be close enough that 3 is enough. But to have how many people doing it, I don't know if he agrees with Rav Chanina Skana Kohanim. Perhaps he feels that on Shabbos you should have 3 people. Why? Because there's a purpose of having 3 people, and that's to publicize that we're doing the mitzvah today. So therefore, and that publicizing the mitzvah is perhaps worth it. Says the Gemara, Abul Hasam Deka Persumi Misa Milsa Emam Karabanis Friole. So perhaps Rabbi Shmuel doesn't agree with Chanina Skana Kohanim, and vice versa. Perhaps Chanina Skana Kohanim doesn't agree with Rabbi Shmuel. Inami ad kan lekamra Chanina Skana Kohanim Hasam dichad oishloisha tzar kavoy misabik l'chasei aval hachad lo yisabik l'chasei tzar kavoy emam Karabanis Friole. And perhaps the opposite is also true. Chanina Skana Kohanim holds that on Shabbos you only have 1 person doing it, because he feels that the publicizing is not worth it, and 1 to 3, the end result is the same. You'll have your barley. But in the shaila of how many saws to thresh to get fine flour, if you believe that 5 will get a better outcome, then maybe he believes you should have 5 saw, not like Rabbi Shmuel, because the outcome is different. And therefore, it's unclear that they agree with each other. One last attempt at a Tana that agrees with Rabbi Shmuel, and again we're going to reject it. Elam Rav Ashi, Rabbi Shmuel, Rav Yossi, Amr Davech. Rabbi Shmuel and Rav Yossi agree with each other. D'Tanan. Which of the Shaila of Rav Yossi? So we know that Kiddush HaChodesh, if someone sees on Friday night the new moon, they would travel to Yerushalayim. Even if that entailed being Mechal Shabbos to travel, it's permissible. Now the question is, what if it's a clear night? So it says the Mishnah, Bein Shenir Ba'al, Bein Shaleinir Ba'al, whether it's a clear night or not, Mechal Shabbos, either way, they're going to go. Now that's a chiddush, because when it's a clear night and I see it in Tel Aviv, You could argue if it's a clear night, Mistama, they see it in Yerushalayim anyway, and it's not necessary for me to travel. But still, the Tanakama says they should travel either way. Comes Rav Yossi and he says, no, if it's a clear night, Ein Mechalvas HaShabbos. You don't go. So what do you see? You see that Rav Yossi feels that if we could try to minimize the Tirchan Shabbos, or in this case the Chil Shabbos, we're going to do that. So perhaps he agrees with Rabbi Shmuel that if the same way he feels that if it's a clear night, it's not worth it to go because Mistama, you're not needed. So to over here, he would agree with Rabbi Shmuel that if I can get the same amount of barley from 3 sa as opposed to 5 sa, stick with 3. In Mechavas HaShabbos, Mila Amar Rav Yossi, Hasam Davshel, Kivin Davshel Etachina, Chanam Kivin Davshel Etachina. So that Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shmuel agree with each other. The Gemara again rejects it. Perhaps they're not related at all. Memai, Dilma Ad Kan Lekam Rabbi Shmuel Hacha El Deleka Nimtzas Atamachshin Lasalava. First of all, I don't know if Rabbi Shmuel agrees with Rabbi Yossi. Just because Rabbi Shmuel is into minimizing Chilul Shabbos does not mean he would agree with Rabbi Yossi. I'll tell you why. Rabbi Yossi's shita is that if the moon is visible on a clear night, you're not Mechal Shabbos. Then that makes a lot of sense. Why do the Rabbanan disagree? The Rabbanan disagree, similar to the reason why Hatzalah members drive back when they go to the hospital. Why is it that Hatzalah members drive back when they go to the hospital, even if they're not necessarily needed for the rest of Shabbos? Because I'll tell you why. It's called Nimtzas Hatamachshil Lasalavo, which means that if a Hatzalah member knows that he's going to be stuck in the hospital for the rest of Shabbos, he may not go in the future. We want to motivate future times going. So too the Chachamim Shita is that if I see it on clear night and I'm in Tel Aviv, go to Yerushalayim. Why? L'chora, statistically, it's not necessary for me to go based on the fact that I'm sure someone else sees it. And the answer is, you're right. But if you don't go this time, then the next time when you are needed, you're not going to go either because you're like, they never need me. And therefore we want to motivate future activities. So it could be Rabbi Shmuel would agree with the Rabbanan. Just because Rabbi Shmuel wants to minimize Chilul Shabbos does not mean he agrees with Rabbi Yossi. Perhaps he agrees that we don't want to be mashal, loss of love. We want them to always be motivated to go, to testify. And if we don't allow them to go now, they're not going to go in the future. And vice versa. Inami Akan the Rav Yossi Hasam El Deleket Tzarich Gavoilin in the Shablichas of a Hachdik the Tzarich Gavoilin in the Shablichas and Karbanos Vila. And the opposite, it's the same svar again, that perhaps Rav Yossi does not agree with Rav Shmuel. I'll tell you why. Rav Yossi believes that there's no Chilul Shabbos in that case because he feels it's not necessary to go when it's a clear night. But over here, where the flour is not as fine when you're using 3 sa as opposed to 5 sa and the outcome is not as good, maybe he believes like the Rabbanan that you should use as much flour as possible, as much sa'as of barley as possible. So therefore they're unrelated. Okay. Now what we're going to talk about until the end of the Amid is situations where a person was Mechal Shabbos, but the outcome might have been okay, but his intention wasn't really great. So Itmar. Shochat shtei chatas shel tzivar. Let's say a person shechs 2 communal chatas on Shabbos, but you only need 1. So you have animal A and animal B. For whatever reason, he shechs both. Accidentally, he thinks it's allowed, whatever it is, he thought you need a backup, whatever it is. So the first one is needed, and the second one is unneeded. So, well, you're chayiv a carbon for shechting the second one. Obviously, the first one was needed, but the second one wasn't needed, so it's Chilul Shabbos. So far, so good. Now, what happens if after I shech the second one, so I'm Chilul Shabbos, I drop the blood of the first one, so it turns out I kind of needed the second one? I feel in iskaber lo b'shniya. You still chayiv a chatas. Why? Because at the time of the shechita, the second one wasn't necessary. The fact that it becomes necessary later is irrelevant. An even bigger chiddush. What if after there's a concept that you want to take the most healthy, strongest animal? Let's say I shech the first one, then I shech the second one. Second one was not necessary. They're doing an investigation of the innards of the first one, and they see that it's not very healthy. It's kosher, but it's not a very healthy animal. The second one is stronger. So l'chora, in this situation, I'd rather use the second one. The second one, actually, we'll see in a moment, that if you have 2 animals, you'd always use the stronger, healthier animals, the carbon, it's better. So over here, l'chora, the second one turns out is very necessary. Still, still you're chayiv, because again, at the time of the shechita, I was not aware of that. It's not like when I shechted the first one, I was like, oh, you know what? The first one, it's not like I shechted the first one, and I realized, oh, this first one's really weak, I got to do the second one. That's not what happened. I just shechted the second one for no reason. So the fact that the first one, taka, is not the healthiest animal, does not change the fact that I'm still Mechal Shabbos. Says the Gemara, is that true? That if I shech the first one and then I shech the second one and it turns out the first one is weak, the innards are not healthy, again, it's not treif, it's not shvach, it's kochush, it's a shvach animal, then I'm going to be chai for the second one, even though the second one turns out is it turns out if you would ask a shaila, if you would, as we're going to see in a moment, according to Rabbi, if I were to shech the first animal and then I check the innards and it's like shvach on Shabbos, and you'd ask a paisik, he would say shech the second one. L'chachila. So the question is over here, at the end of the day, maybe my intention wasn't great, but like, I taka did nothing wrong. The second one, and it's not like, you see, in the case where I dropped the blood, you could say, okay, well, at least when you shechted the second one, the first one was eligible, and then you happened to drop the blood, making the second one necessary. But at least at the time, the first one was eligible, second one wasn't necessary. But if you shech the first one, then check the second one, and then you realize the first one was taka shvach, that means the first one was never really l'chachila to be used anyway. And if you'd ask a shaila, he would say l'chachila to shech the second one. So what did I do wrong? Umiyam Rabbi Hachi, did Rabbi say that in that case you chayev chados? Didn't Rabbi say if you have two communal chatos on Shabbos, one is fat and one is lean, shachat shmeina. Then you shach the shmeina, v'achach shachat shusha. So you shach the healthy one, and then you shach the shvach one. Now, you're chayiv for shechting the second one because the second one, it's unnecessary and it's shvach, so it's bechlal unnecessary. But chusha, but if you slaughter the lean one, the achach shmeina, and then you realize, no, I'm going to shech the fatter one, potter, you're potter. You shechted two. The answer is, but when you shechted the first one, the second one was taka necessary because the second one is better. And not only is it in the case of accident, we would actually tell you l'chachila after shechting the first one, that you should l'chachila shech the second one. So in this case, if I shech the first one, then I shech the second one, it turns out the first one was shvach, I didn't do anything wrong retroactively. It turns out I did nothing wrong. So why is that I'm chayiv v'chatos? So the Gemara says, you're right, erase that from the first statement. Meaning, when Rabbi originally said that you're chayiv v'chatos for that situation, take that out. Or, or change the name. It wasn't Rabba, it was Ravami. Meaning, and Rabba taka holds you not chayiv, but Ravami holds you are chayiv. So, make it a machloikas. Okay. Amr li Ravina li Ravashi, nimtzas harishayna k'chusha b'nei mayim, mahu. So, a very similar case. I shecht, Rabba had just said that if you shecht the first animal, and then you find out that it's chusha, and then you shech the second, it's fine. So, you understand the case. You shechted the first one, you investigate it, you find it shvach, then you shech the second one, that's fine to do. What if, like this, nimtzas harishayna chusha b'nei mayim, what if I shech the first, and then I shech the second, and then I investigate the first, and I realize that it was lean? So it's very similar to the shayla that we had before. The shayla is, after you shech the second, you realize the first one was shvach, so the question is, Mahu, what's the halacha? Are you potter from shechting the second or not? That was the shayla we had before. Basar machshavta is lean, and do we go by the machshav of a person? Meaning, I shechted both. When I shechted the second one, I was intending to be Mechal Shabbos. Turns out, we investigated the first, and the first one was shvach. So it turns out I didn't do anything wrong, but my machshava was terrible. So do we go by machshava of the gaver le'isur k'mechaven, and the person's machshava was to be Mechal Shabbos, or dilma basamaisa vaslina, or do we go by the end result? And the end result was you didn't do anything wrong. So it says the Gemara Amar Le, lav hainu de Rabba v'Rava. Is this not the shaila of Rab and Rava, as we'll have in a moment? Ditzmar shama shetava tinik beyam. People hear that a kid is drowning. Uparis mitzubal halos dogim, and you have a fisherman who's not Shem Shabbos, and he casts out the net, not to catch the kid, he casts out the net to catch fish. The hella dogim, and fish come out. So that's chayiv. That's pasha. That's chayiv. His intention is to Mechal Shabbos, and the end result is Chil Shabbos. He didn't even save the kid. But lahalis dogim. But if his intention is Mechal Shabbos, he's going to trap to catch fish. So he sends out a net to catch fish. The hella dogim v'tinik. But in addition to the fish, the child is in there. So the question is, his intention was a Mechal Shabbos, but the end result was that he did a Ma'asav Atzala. So Rabbi Amar Chayiv, Rabbi says Yechayiv, Pashas because you go by the Machshava. Rabbi says Chayiv, but Rabbi Amar Potter. So you see, it's a Machloikas. And the Gemara says no. Ad kan Rabbi loy kapotar elakim the sham amrina nami daiti atinik avaloy shamaloy. And the Gemara argues that this shaila, by the case of the fish and the child, the only reason why Rabbah holds your potter is because at the end of the day, the fisherman knew that there was a kid drowning. So maybe he says his intention was to catch fish, but at the end of the day, in the back of his mind, he knew there was a kid drowning. And he knew there's a possibility he'll save the kid. But if let's say he didn't know that the kid was drowning, and he's just going out to fish, Mamash Mechal Shabbos, turns out he saves the kid, Pasha said Chayiv. Because over there, his intention is 100% terrible. And he was Mechal Shabbos, but it turns out that part of the Chil Shabbos was permitted. But his intention was Mechal Shabbos. The Gemara argues over here as well. You shechted the second animal, your intention was the Mechal Shabbos. It turns out that the first one was weakened, that doesn't matter. you're still going to be chayiv b'chatas. So that's the conclusion, and it's not related to Rav and Rabba, because Rav and Rabba's case is where the fisherman knew that there was a kid drowning. But had he not known, he'd be chayiv, and that's our case. Igad Amrisam have a different version, that Amar Lei Hainu Plutay de Rabba Rav. Instead of saying that Rab and Rava would agree, he says, no, this is the machlekes. Dietmar Shama Shatav Tinik Bayam, Uparas Mitzu Lahalis Dogim Hela Dogim Chayiv, Lahalis Dogim Vehela Tinik V'Dogim Rabba Potter Rabba Chayiv, Rabba Potter Zilbasam Aiso, Rabba Chayiv Zilbasam Achshavtoi. So over here, you see that the machlekes Rav and Rab is whether you go with the machshava or the maisa. So to over here, it's the same. So according to this version, it's taka machlekes Rab and Rab. Amar Rabba, choyla shamdu legregres achas. If a sick person was assessed by the doctor that he needs one dried fig on Shabbos, and 10 people run, this is mamash a case of Hatzalah, v'ratzu asar b'nei adam v'aviu asar gregres b'asachas. 10 people run, and they all caught one dried fig from the tree, and they bring it to him. So 10 people Mechal Shabbos, but only one person is needed. It's mamash like a case of Hatzalah where 10 people drive, and only one Hatzalah member is necessary. The halacha is P'turim. None of them are chayiv for Chilul Shabbos, because each one was doing it with the right intention. Each one was trying to be Meitzel Nefashis. Afilu b'zachazeh, and even if they don't get there at the same time, even if they get one after the other, the last guy is still going to be Pater, because again, he was Isaac in Hatzalas Nefashis. And even if by the time the last guy gets it, the guy's already healthy. So his mamish, his entire act, the guy was already fine. But it doesn't matter. From his perspective, he was Isaac and that's all nefashos. By Rava Sakasha. So let's say the doctor says that a person who's sick and he needs 2 dried figs. And the choice is, I have 2 dried figs on 2 different stems, so it will be 2 acts of cutting. Or I have 1 stem that has 3 figs on it. So it's 1 act of cutting, but then I'm going to get more than I need. So the question is it kedai for me to cut both stems and do 2 acts of Chil Shabbos, but at least I'll only get what I need, or do 1 act of Chil Shabbos, but I'll be getting more figs than necessary. So I'm like cutting more than necessary on Shabbos. Do we say that cut the 2 stems because you only need 2? Or really cut the 1, at least you're doing less Ketzira. So pshita shalosh masinan, it's better to cut the 1 that has 3 figs on to go to the next page. Even though Rabbi Shmuel in the Mishnah said that it's better to do 3 as opposed to 5, that's because it's less Chil Shabbos. But over here, 2 figs as opposed to 3 is actually more Chil Shabbos because you're cutting more stems. We don't want you to be marbe with Chil Shabbos, and therefore cut the 1 stem, which is less Chil Shabbos. Okay, the Mishnah says, mitzvahs ha'omer lahavi min hakarev. The mitzvah of the omer, which is to bring the barley on the 2nd day of Pesach, we bring it from the closest place to Yerushalayim. Now, loy bikar, the Gemara will explain why. Loy bikar hakarev Yerushalayim, let's say there is no barley close to Yerushalayim that's ready, then obviously bring it from any place necessary. Now, Maisa, the story goes that there was one time, sheba ha'omer megagas strifin, that they once brought omer from a place called Gagas Strifin, and Shtei Alechem that year they brought Mebikas Ein Seicher from the valley of Ein Seicher. The Gemara will explain why this was a specific story that happened at the beginning of the process of the Romans taking over the Yerushalayim. Now, my time, and why is it that we bring the Omer from the closest place Yerushalayim, bring the barley from closest Yerushalayim to Iba Yisem Hashem Carmel? The pasuk says Carmel, which means plump. You want it to be soft, and if you bring it from far away, it could dry in the process of travel. Or perhaps there's aim of mitzvahs. You have an opportunity to bring it as close as you can, the closest aim of mitzvahs. Now, what's the story historically that we brought Omer from Gagas Strifin? So Tana Rabbanon, Kishetzaru Malchus Beis Chashmonai Zalzeh. This is there was an infighting in the Chashmonaim between Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. And they brought Aristobulus brought in the Romans to help fight. They brought in Pompey, and he eventually took over, which led to the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash a while later, about 100 something years later, with the Romans taking over. They made a deal with the Romans. Now during that time there was a battle between Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. Hyrcanus was outside of Yerushalayim trying to break in, and Aristobulus was inside. And while they're fighting, they still have to bring karbanos. So you have the people inside need the animals from outside, and they're fighting with each other. So Aristobulus every day, those inside the walls of Yerushalayim would lower dinarim in a basket, Umaylan lehen tamidim, and outside they would put a lamb to bring the daily karbanis. There's a Pel de Gazach. The Mamish having a civil war, and they're still bringing karbanis. Now, a certain man was inside, an old man, and he knew Chachmas Yivanis, which is some sort of communication through signals. And he basically told like this, that if the people outside want to conquer Yushalayim, the only way to conquer Yushalayim is to stop the karbanos. So if you stop supplying animals for the Tamid, then the Yushalayim's Kedusha will fall and you'll be able to conquer it. So he says, Kol Zman, he's hinted to them. I'm just recording, hold on. Kol Zman she'asukim ba'avoida. As long as they are oisik in the avoida, einim sarm biyadchem. Then you're not going to be able to destroy Yushalayim. So the Machar Shilshal and Dinar Bekupa. So the next day he lowered Dinarim in a basket, the Helen Chazir. But instead of putting a Tamid, an animal, the lamb, they put a Chazir. Kivin Shagil Chatzi Chayma. When the Chazir got to the halfway up the walls, Yushalayim, no, it's Siparna B'chayma, it stuck its hooves into the wall. V'nezazeh Eretz Yisrael Arba Me'ez Parsa Arba Me'ez Parsa, and Eretz Yisrael shook 400 Parsa by 400 Parsa by Yisha Amru. And at that moment they said, Orur she'igad l'chazer, it's cursed anyone who raises pigs. Orur she'yilma b'nei chachim Yavanis, curses anyone who teaches his son this Greek Yavanis that they use to communicate. V'aleisa shashaninu, and in that year it said that was the year that there was a civil war. So because there was a civil war, they couldn't get barley from close Yerushalayim because the soldiers had already destroyed it. That's the year that they brought the oimer from Gagas Srifin and Shtei Lechem Bikas Ein Tzeicher. Now, what's the story of how did they specifically get it? So, Kimata Omer, when the second day of Pesach came around, there was no barley to get it. So, Achroz, they announced that whoever has barley should notify them. Also, there was a certain mute man who came forward, he couldn't talk, and Oisiv, and he tried to communicate where there's barley. And he said, Oisiv Chode Yode Igra, he put one hand on a roof, which is a gag, V'chode Yode Tzifra, and one hand on a hut, Tzifra, gag Tzifra. That was so Gagas Srifin, he was trying to allude to the place called Gagas Srifin, so he put one hand on a gag and one hand on a tzaref. So they said, Mia Gaducht Amr Lahu Mordechai. Mordechai. Now Rashi says this is Mordechai HaYehud, Mordechai from the story of Purim. Now that means, by the way, he lived a very, very long time, because you're talking about hundreds of years after the Purim story. But anyway, Taisus disagrees, because Taisus says that Mordechai could not have lived that long, and rather he says that it's rather Mordechai was a title that they gave to Chachamim. The wisest person at the time was called Mordechai after the Mordechai Yehudi of Ish Yehudi Shmuel Mordechai. But Rashi says this is the Mordechai of the Purim story. So he said he sees this mute man put his hand on a gag and a tzrif. He says, Mi ikka duchta, is there a place, the Shema Gagas Tzrifin, Tzrifin Gagas, is there a place that have these words in it? So Bad Kavesh, they found a place called Gagas Tzrifin, and they understood that there was barley there. Same thing happened with the She'elechem, Kibayla She'elechem, Leviyad Mechel. So they didn't know where to get the wheat for Shtei Lechem. Ichros, they announced, also Gav Charsha, again, that same person came, Oisiv Yada Ona, he put his hand on his eye, ayin, V'chad Yada Asichra, and one on a door socket, Seicher. So Mordechai, again, Mordechai said, Mi Gaduchte de Shema Ayin Seicher or Seicher Ayin. Is there a place called Ayin Seicher or Seicher Ayin? Bad Kaveshchi, and they looked and they found. Now, just to finish up, we'll go to the next Mishnah. The Gemara says, to talk about Mordechai's greatness and his ability to understand messages. The Gemara says, Haru Shloisha Noshim. There were 3 women that came to the Beis HaMikdash, Daisu Shloisha Kinim, and they brought 3 pairs of birds. Now, the question is, what is the purpose of these birds? So one woman said, Lizivasi, it's from my ziva. One said, Liyamasi, from my yama. And one said, Lo'inasi. Now, what does that mean? So Savramina, so they understood, they thought that they're all saying the same thing. They're all zavs. One said, and a zav has to bring a chatas and an oila. The 2 birds are chatas and oila. So one said zivasi zavamamish, means she's saying a ziva. When she said yamasi means like a flow like the river. She's saying I'm a ziva, flow like river. Oinasi is oinasa, her time of the month, a ziva. So they just assumed that these are 3 different ways of saying zav, and 3 chatas, 3 oilas. The kulu chada chatas chada oila. Amlu Mordechai understood no. Mordechai said they're not actually talking about zav at all, but rather these are 3 people who want to thank Hashem like a carbon toida, and these are all oilas. Shema bezoiv sichna. When she said she was a zav, she doesn't mean that she's big mitahar for the tumah of zav, but rather when she was a zav, when she was having, they're all having, the Zav, she might have seen blood, but it actually put her in danger. She was hemorrhaging. And it was a medical issue. And she wants to thank Hashem for being saved. And therefore it's an oila. And when the other one said Yamasi, it meant Yam. She traveled by the river. And she was in danger at sea. And when the other one said Oinasi, it means Eina Sichna. It means there was something wrong with her eye. But these are all thanking Hashem for coming out of danger. In which case, Kula Oilus Ninu. They're all oilus. They're all just optional oilus. So that's what Mordechai felt. But they looked into it, and it was taka true. Just to get to the Mishnah, and this is what it means in the Mishnah, Pesachia Lakinim. Pesachia was the administrator in the Beis HaMikdash in charge of the birds. And who is Pesachia? Is a Mordechai. That was a reference to Mordechai. He was in charge of the birds. And the Gemara says, why was he called Pesachia? Because he was able to open up things that were closed off. And he also knew the 70 languages. Now the Gemara says, Akasha, you tell me it's so impressive that Mordechai knew the 70 languages. I thought every member of Sanhedrin had to. Kula Sanhedrin nami yad shivim lashon. Dam Rav Yechon, didn't Rav Yechon say, Ein mashim b'Sanhedrin el bali chachma. To sit in the Sanhedrin, you have to be smart. Bali mara, you have to have an imposing appearance. Bali koimi, you have to be tall. Bali zikna, you have to be old. Bali kshafim, you have to know witchcraft, so that to know that if you get someone condemned to death, that they're not going to use witchcraft to escape. And you have to know the 70 languages. So you'll be able to listen to the witnesses directly. You have to know all the languages. So why is there a big shevach to Mordechai? I thought all the members of Sanhedrin knew the 70 languages. The answer is, he didn't just know the 70 languages. He was able to explain the nuance and the slang. He understood it. Wasn't just understanding. He was able to darshan the 70 languages. That's when Mordechai was balshan, is because he was able to mix languages together and combine languages and explain it. I will stop it.